There's Joseph P. Kennedy, the father of John F. Kennedy, of course, who was Roosevelt's ambassador to Great Britain in 1940. Also, another person who I think has been badly, his performances have been badly distorted in the historical record. He was thought to be also a Nazi sympathizer and an isolationist and so on. There are elements of that in his behavior, but mostly he thought, as did Lindbergh and many others, including George C. Marshall, the great hero of the home front in the war, the great organizer of victory, so-called, that the Nazis were probably going to win, and in fact the British might even throw in the towel. And in fact the British came damn near to throwing in the towel until Winston Churchill came along. So he was not so much a Nazi sympathizer as a kind of a cold-eyed analyst of just what the prospects of British survival were and whether it made sense for the United States to transfer resources to Britain when they might eventually fall into German hands. Okay, I like to show this poster in my classroom. It contains some of the most famous images, artistic images that come down to us from this period. You all know what it is, I suppose. It's Norman Rockwell's artistic rendition of the so-called Four Freedoms. And those of you who've been to the Roosevelt Memorial in Washington, D.C., in my view, the best of all the memorials in Washington because it tells an historical story instead of just glorifying an individual. And as you walk from room to room, you see these Four Freedoms. They're one of the organizing principles of the way the whole exhibit is laid out. But this is maybe a subtle point, but I think an interesting one. If you go back and read the speech in which Franklin Roosevelt first articulated the Four Freedoms in 1941, it's the speech where he formally introduces, guess what, the Lend-Lease bill to the Congress. It's a speech about foreign policy. And what he says is, in effect, what he says is, these are America's war aims. Freedom of speech, and I'm now quoting him, everywhere in the world. Freedom of religion, everywhere in the world. Freedom from fear, everywhere in the world. Freedom from want, everywhere in the world. It's an international program. It's a war aims program. That's what he's describing. But Norman Rockwell doesn't render it that way. He renders it as something that's already part of the fabric of American culture that has to be preserved and defended here, not something that has to be exported to the rest of the world or that will form the basis for the reorganization of the international system. So to me, this is maybe too subtle to really take hold with your students or even my students. But nevertheless, an important point that probably the most popular artist of this era takes a set of international themes about Roosevelt's aspirations for the global system, and brings them back home and makes them purely domestic themes in these famous, iconic posters that were everywhere during the war, and you still see so frequently. So this is another reminder of how, to put it in its most charitable terms, maybe how parochial America's view of the world was, how Americans in popular culture really had difficulty grasping that they were in a conflict that had implications for reshaping the international order. The only way they could really take on board these statements of Roosevelt about freedom, the Four Freedoms, was to domesticate them, to internalize them, to make them things that were true of America here at home, but really didn't have much to do with the international order, which is exactly not what Roosevelt meant when he gave the famous Four Freedoms address. Okay, let me just remind myself what else we have here. Okay, this is the USS Arizona, of course, the battleship that was most severely damaged at Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941, now constitutes the basis of the great memorial there at Pearl Harbor, if you've ever been there. Something I'd just like to point out about this, a little sidebar here. How many of you have seen the documentary film Restrepo? Nobody? Well, it's about Afghanistan. It's made by Sebastian Junger and this British photographer, Tim Hetherington, who was later killed. And it's about a U.S. Squad, or a platoon, I guess it is, on what's called an FOB, a forward operating base in Afghanistan. It's just a gritty documentary about these 30-some young men and what they went through. And the filmmaker, Sebastian Junger, he's the guy who wrote the book, The Perfect Storm, if you ever read that book or saw the film. Anyway, he was on Stanford campus last week, and the film was shown to students. And Junger and I, had a little bit of a conversation with a group of a few dozen students one evening before they screened the film. And Junger, for obvious reasons, having made this film about Afghanistan, is very interested in pictorial or graphic or visual representations of war. And we fell to discussing the way World War II was rendered visually. And something came up that he didn't know, and I happen to know. It's kind of an arcane factoid. But it remains a mystery to me why this is still the case. But here you are. This is one among many, 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 many photographs of the damage done at Pearl Harbor. And though this is not the kind of thing that you would probably notice at first glance, if I mention it to you, you're going to get it right away. There's something conspicuous by its absence in this photograph and in this photograph, and these are only two samples. I could show you 100 of these photographs, maybe 1,000 of them. You will never see in any of these photographs, to this day, the Defense Department has not released photographs of Pearl Harbor that show any dead bodies. There were dead bodies floating all over the harbor. That boat that you see there going out probably had to make its way through a lot of floating corpses. But the War Department would not, or the Navy Department would not allow the release of photographs showing dead Americans at Pearl Harbor. To this day, photographic evidence of Pearl Harbor that's been released doesn't show any dead bodies. This is the first photograph of dead Americans that the government allowed, dead GIs, that the government allowed to be released in World War II. It's on a beach in Buna in New Guinea. Photographs taken in 1942. It's not released and published until July of 1943 in Life magazine. And it's conspicuous because it was, among other things, a very artfully contrived photograph, the triangular shape of the hull, the triangular formation of the bodies, the lines, and so on. But you also don't see anybody's face, quite conspicuously. Now, why did the War Department withhold the publication of anything like this until 1943? Well, as I'm going to come back to in a bit, because the deep anxiety persisted amongst American policymakers, and again, this cuts across the grain of one of the scenes that was depicted in that film last evening about everybody rushing to the colors and volunteering en masse and so on. The War Department feared that if the American people saw too graphically and grittily what was actually going on out there, they might lose their appetite for continuing the fight. And so there was a deliberate policy not to take a chance with reigniting this deep isolationist sentiment that had been so prominent in the 1930s, and therefore not allowing the publication of this kind of stuff until relatively late in the war. Well, here's Roosevelt and Churchill. It doesn't show well here. A famous photograph of them at the Casablanca Conference. That's where they announced the doctrine of unconditional surrender. And here's where the rubber really starts to meet the road, I think. Okay, this is the Willow Run plant making B-24s, I believe, in Michigan in 1942-43. Okay. All right, well, I've got us down now to the war itself, and let me just set the stage here, as it were, by sharing with you 4 comments from the historical record, all of them by major actors in this great dramatic episode of the war, as a way of reminding us all of what the American position was relative to this great conflict as of December 7th, 1941, okay, Pearl Harbor Day. We have an ear witness to what Adolf Hitler said when he heard the news of the Pearl Harbor attack. It's recorded in William Shimer's great book, The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. Hitler heard the news of the Pearl Harbor attack the way the rest of the world heard it, over the newswire on the radio. He had no prior knowledge of the attack. The Japanese hadn't bothered to inform him. Which is another reminder that the Japanese-German alliance was a very opportunistic and very thin affair. There was no strategic coordination between Germany and Japan. There was no joint war planning. There was no significant sharing of materiel or troops or information or intelligence or what have you. In some ways, the Japanese aggression in the Pacific was wholly parasitic on the disruptions that Hitler worked on the European state system. It was a very thin alliance. So Hitler gets the news, it's a surprise to him, on the morning of December 7th, 1941, and he said, so the Ear Witness reports, "Now it is impossible for us to lose the war because we have an ally in Japan who has never been vanquished in 3,000 years." So Hitler's first reflex, his first response to this news is to be filled with and invigorated with energy and confidence that now German victory is absolutely assured. Now, what we are allowed to believe is, for all practical purposes, the same moment in time. It can't be different by much more than minutes or hours at the most. Winston Churchill, several hundred miles to the westward across the English Channel, gets the same news. In the same way, he had no prior knowledge of the Pearl Harbor attack, believe you me. And he gets the same news. We don't have a witness to what he actually said at that moment, but what we do have is Churchill's effort in his memoir after the war. It's called The Grand Alliance, is the volume in this memoir, where he tries to make the reader understand